honored guest. I will speak Polish, but my English very poor. In my young years, I learned French and German. To proszę mi pozwolić mówić po polsku.
Allow me to speak Polish. And I was asked to present Professor Wojciech Suchocki from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. Professor Suchocki is an art historian. Since 2010, he's been the director of the National Museum in Poznań. As an art historian, he studied the work of the Polish painter Piotr Michałowski. He's published In Place of Conscience in the wake of Martin Heidegger's thinking on art. And now he is studying the work of Atanazy Raczyński, the legacy of Atanazy Raczyński, an art collector and aristocrat from Wielkopolska. The title of his presentation in English, Matejko, How Did He Do It? And the paper will be about Jan Matejko, a Polish painter. I would like to add that Jan Matejko is, in a way, a shared Central European hero, because on his father's side, he came from a Czech family. Jan Matejko was very popular in Hungary. Just to give you one example, a very interesting example, you might have heard about this professor. I'd like to know. In Budapest, since 1958, we've had a statue of King Stefan Batory. The unveiling of the monument was very interesting, but I want to say that the monument, the sculpture, was based on the famous painting by Jan Matejko, Stefan Batory at Pskov. So that was the model for the Hungarian sculptor. And now, Professor Wojciech Suchocki, if I could ask for your presentation. First, a few words in Polish. I'd prefer to speak Polish, but fortunately I have the English version of my presentation written down.
And really, my speech will be about work of Jan Matejko. The title of my speech probably promises too much and raises expectations that cannot be met. Unraveling the secrets of the structure and impact of even one painting by Jan Matejko is a task that goes beyond the confines of a single speech. I will try, as much as I can, on the basis of a single painting and its many and varied aspects, seen as particularly significant, to initiate a reflection on Matejko's concept of the historical painting. Before I present to you my observations triggered by one of the works from main cycle of his great historical paintings, painted over 3 decades of his life, he died at the age of 55, I recall as a kind of a long motto, a comprehensive, repeatedly quote, record of his programmatic statement. I quote, "It may, or rather must, be true that a painting can present only one material moment of some issue. but it should conceive and present this moment so that it would express the historical incident in its entirety, with all the spiritual factors and elements that informed this event. However, rarely can we find in history a moment so completely characteristic that it would embrace and give a full account of the historical process and fact. A historical incident does not take place abruptly, out of the blue. It is triggered by a whole process of aspirations and actions of various people who were present or, conversely, did not happen to be in attendance at the moment and in the place where the fact ultimately happened. In truth, all these people had acted as the forces that triggered it and had brought it about, even from the distance of time or from that of place. Therefore, the painting, which is to demonstrate the incident in this entirety, has every right and indeed should draw and show all these forces within its frames. Only then will the historical painting be a truly autonomous image rather than a slave chronicle illustration. It will then be a focus and autonomous rendition of what is scattered and dispersed in the chronicles and yet belongs to the entire fact. Then the painter will assume the role of an artist as a history author, a judge of sort of both the fact itself and of all the forces and elements at work within it. Further on, Matejko adds, I cannot work as I would like to. I do not compose and do not paint as I understand the artistic conditions of a perfect painting. I am after much more important matters. I am after the expression of a character or a clarity of a group more than I am after the purity of the line and the beauty of the arrangement. The end of quotation. And now to the point. Reitan. The name of a deputy from the constituency of Novogród during the 1773 parliament has for a long time been incorporated into the common parlance and has become, as rhetoric calls it, an antonomasia, a proper name used to define a particular type of person or behavior. This was due to his protest against the adoption by the Polish Sejm of treaties approving the first partition of Poland by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Tadeusz Reitan, who died a suicidal death 7 years after his protest, quickly became a mythical figure. He was honored by the 4-year Sejm, whose activities were a significant attempt at regaining sovereignty and reforming the state, frustrated by the reaction of two neighboring countries and the second partition of Poland in 1793. 2 years later, as a result of the third partition, Poland disappeared from the map. The map I'm showing indicates the successive stages of this disappearance. The figure of Reitan was immortalized in national memory by the greatest Polish poet, Adam Mickiewicz, in his epic poem, Pan Tadeusz. Let us note at this point that Mickiewicz may have actually been Matejko's greatest inspiration. The ample relevant literature on Matejko's oeuvre has primarily focused on the principal motives of his paintings, especially on their relation to the historical knowledge of the author's time and scenes. Texts on Matejko art have less often addressed the importance of the historical incident, which Matejko indicated via his artistic choices of, as himself called it, artist as history author. The Reitan painting is a case in point. On the one hand, following the author's instructions, critics and viewers referred to the figures called by names, wondered about their role in the painting, and on the other hand, discussed the context of the painting origin, the debates generated and its status among the diagnosis of the nature of the event it depicts. A question arises whether all the components of the painting's structure informing its meaning were taken into account. One cannot possibly, in a short lecture, given an account of the history of the work's reception, to provide a description of its construction or even to offer short presentations and descriptions of the 30 persons participating in the scene. Every single painting by Matejko, especially of the grand historical series, offers food for thought worthy a separate book. I will try to provide a gloss to this history, focusing on the elements which have not been scrutinized before, which are to my mind worthy of utmost attention. For instance, in the epoch-making book written over 100 years ago by Stanisław Witkiewicz, a painter and eminent critic, we can read about the impossibility of a historical painting precisely in connection with Reitan. Allow me to offer one more long quote, the last one, so Witkiewicz. Painting, fatalistically doomed to present a single moment only, is incapacitated and powerless with respect to the questions addressed by history. Painting, including historical painting, made use of allegories, symbols, or even legends in the work itself to supplement its message. Matejko, whose mind and talent were perfectly suited to comprehend concrete facts and tangible things, clear and evident forms, wrestled with this limited character of the means of his art, struggled and often marred his paintings or included some naive concepts which were supposed to add to what of the historical content boiled in his mind and what his sensitive heart felt. This time in Reitan, however, despite the mental struggle with the artistic means, the painting is perfect. Matejko's most exquisite talents include his mastery over the expression of human emotions and his fine-tuned sensitivity to the most intense motion of the human soul, touched by a tragic clash of passion and the outside reality. This ability is plain in each and every figure. Matejko expressed only what the medium of painting allowed him to do, the relation of a particular individual to a particular crowd. This relation was based on certain emotions. The rest is beyond the realm of painting, and the person to whom the entry Reitan in a catalogue means nothing at all. One who cannot know or feel what we, Poles, can feel. The French actually thought that the valiant Poles were throwing away a Turkish envoy. Yet this incomprehensibility of anecdote of a historical painting, albeit an argument against historical painting, is not the fault of the painting and does not reduce its artistic value. If we struck all incomprehensible paintings from the list of masterpieces, only few would survive. The entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and the entire Raphael, apart from the portraits, would be classified as incomprehensible curios. The end of quotation. We might try and reflect whether Witkiewicz did not leave out some measures on overcoming the difficulties under discussion available to painting. Perhaps Matejko made use of them. Let us recall the most fundamental circumstances of the painting's origin. As a painter, Isidor Jabłoński, a friend of Matejko's, recorded, most likely under the powerful impact of photographs of the casualties in the incidents of Warsaw in 1861, Matejko made a decision to change his earlier planned subjects. I will start with the wounds, he thought. This decision contributed to the painting of an 1866 triad. The Sermon of Skarga, Unfinished Polonia, Poland Bound, and the Fall of Poland, Reitan. Another painting executed at the time was Stańczyk, wise gesture of Polish king from 16th century and self-portrait Matejko's at the same time. Skarga catapulted Matejko to fame. The 26-year-old painter was raised to the top and saw an opportunity to implement the great intention to render history in painting. Reitan, much as it was admired, was met with scathing criticism. Making a reservation that the remarks that will follow are perforce fragmentary, let us take into account first that Matejko, as usual, apart from choosing the event and learning as much as possible about it, had to channel this knowledge into a painting. This called for preparing a list of the figures so that the painting could depict, in his own words, the historical incident in its entirety. In line with this reasoning, we see in the painting those who were actually absent there and then. If we can see it. Okay. King Stanislaus Augustus of Poland, Russian envoy Repnin, Szczęsny Potocki. Do you know who is who? Or no? Repnin, Stanisław August. I think you know very good these persons, and about two Potockis for the moment. Franciszek Salezy Potocki had died a year before, and the portrait of Tsar Katerina was not displayed on the wall of the deputy's room of the royal castle in Warsaw. Moreover, however, it called for a great number of decisions related to the painting medium, not necessarily familiar to those interpreting the work. This translation of knowledge about an event into the painting is always facilitated by the formulas and ways of representation which, stored in memory, suddenly flare up with applicability. Most importantly, this sudden eruption allows one to discern and sense the registers of significance which they possess and which can come into play in the painting construction. Let us start with a seemingly insignificant example. An illustration by Moritz von Schwind for Edward Duller's book Erzherzog Karl von Österreich, published in Vienna in 1847. The theme is not, therefore, closely tied with Matejko's painting. Although Dumouriez's Arresting the Convention Deputies, the history of this figure and contemporary setting of the event, 1793, call for reflection as well. First, as an illustration of a historical incident, the above example indicated a certain trace of how Matejko looked for the sources of his painting, not only the visual tokens of era depicted in the work, but historical illustration in general. We encounter examples when Matejko does not refer to something closely related to the fact to be depicted, but rummaging through historiographic texts, which he lived through rather than read, as he did no foreign languages, found inspiration for the construction of his painting. More importantly, the illustration includes both the motifs used in the Reitan painting and the idea for the scene layout, which will prove useful in Matejko's oeuvre since Stańczyk and Skarga. As to the motifs, the transition to the adjacent space with the motif of soldiers standing there, a compact group of the three figures and finally the gestures of an outstretched arm, although transformed, clearly point to this inconspicuous illustration. As to the scene direction, we may suspect that we are witness here to the stabilization of Matejko's imagery and the way the painting will open up for him as potential field of action. We can observe how he will develop the surface and space of the painting and invest it with a variety of meanings. Matejko allows the viewer to first see the space as if it were the continuation of the space in front of the painting. The slanting floor, the slanting pattern of the carpet in the Sermon of Skarga, intensifies the impression. However, hardly does the viewer walk a few paces forward when he will encounter an obstacle and at the same time a suspension of the significance of space recognition. The path is obstructed by a crowd of figures amassed on the surface as if projected onto a screen, and the further road to meaning entails the recognition of the mutual interrelations. The path leads to the feet of three full-figure traitors. On both sides of the group, the foreground is filled by Reitan thrown onto the floor and by an upturned armchair tucked to the edge of the painting space on the other side. The chair is most likely that of the speaker of the same. Reitan tried to sit there, yet it was captured and overthrown by the Delia of Franciszek Salezy Potocki, who left the room as a token of protest against those acting as authority of parliament. We cannot omit the telling presence and materiality of the piece of furniture and of the object scattered across the floor. Both the object in the foreground and the properties of the composition make us consider in relation to Reitan painting another one. Fourth recruitment by Arthur Grodger, the opening chart, if we disregard the title page, of the Polonia series of 1863, inspired directly by the outbreak of the January uprising, which Matejko supported as he best could, shipping arms to Langiewicz camp, a unit of the insurgent army, with the historian and writer Józef Szujski. Matejko admired Grodger and invoked him more often than has been identified so far. The overtuned chair is, then, a kind of repoussoir that opens up a shallow space, a metonymy of violence and forced home intrusion. At the same time, the space gets enclosed and the rush forward inside is offset by the motion along the surface from one side of the field to another. This motion is set by the central figure, whose way of appearance is not only marked by a solemn gesture, but by its concise, simple, and clear shape. The figure links what takes place in the room and behind the open door. What is more, it sets in motion the narrative and arranges the components of the scene into the outcome of what has taken place, of what is taking place, and of what will occur, which slightly reduced the register of the deficiencies of painting indicated by Witkiewicz. Matejko not only adopted the manner of arranging the foreground and opening a second space, but appreciated the way of depicting this figure, especially that he had noticed these elements in Grodger atelier, namely in chart 4 of the Warsaw II, a series made in 1862. Although the cycle was quickly bought by a private collector, this chart was reproduced in the magazine coming out in Vienna. Its depiction in a widow photoshows the figure from the forced recruitment, or rather makes use of the expression of inscribing a figure into the simple shape of a right-angled triangle. So short, my hand. Right-angled triangle with its internal dynamic divisions which show the figure not so much standing near the column, but being pushed across the space of the church. In many of his paintings, Matejko highlights some figures by inscribing them into a simple shape. In Reitan, he decided to subordinate to him the figure of Potocki the father, leaving the gathering with a flourish. Potocki standing out from the crown of figures, stressing the juxtaposition between Reitan and the traitors, is the third focus of the event, and besides is the only figure which looks at and extends the hands to the viewer. While nearly all the figures, especially those of Potocki's right, direct their gaze towards the depth of the painting, as if following Poniński gestures, he takes the opposite direction, and the trail of his robe throws towards the viewer, under his feet, objects that provide a commentary on the scene. Once we discern this inscribing of his figure into the shape of Grodger's widow, we tend to link the painting first of all with its era, with what was taking place there and then, with why Matejko painted the picture. Moreover, it transposes onto his figure the stigma of widowhood, and thus imparts it with a more general meaning. Potocki loses his son. They seem to be a cleft tree trunk, a wedge of crowded, confronting heads between them. The figures exhibit a host of different reactions. Reitan's companion Korsak has Matejko facial features between Potocki, young and old. You can see it is not Matejko. It is just companion Reitan's Korsak. Korsak has Matejko's facial features, and the boy in a cap with a saber is usually interpreted as a harbinger of a future awakening and struggle. Finally, let us focus on Reitan. The familiarity with the painting in our imagination makes you see his conduct as something natural and obvious. Not only does Reitan lie on the floor and block the way to the door, but through his dramatic gestures of tearing his clothes stresses the ultimate character of the act. This is what should be like. And yet this depiction of Reitan in the painting is justified by a number of significant factors. First, Reitan is depicted in a way which shows him as blocking entry to the adjacent room on the plane rather than within space. Even the way his body is arranged can raise doubts. The same applies to the correctness of his anatomy. For instance, the distant leg blocking the traitor's path. Is it not so that Reitan blocks the way to the next room to the viewers more than he does to those are actually standing in the doorway? Perhaps for some reasons his pose had to be precisely that. Second, obstructing passage to the door, Reitan is at the same time linked to the something else, with the curtain which fills up the prominent right margin of the painting. Again, we are faced with doubts as to the correctness of the spatial relation, which is no less persuasive. Reitan clings to something which we initially treat as immaterial. We notice, however, a curtain on the other side of the door and at the opposite edge of the field, in both cases drawn and wavy by Ksawery Branicki, and the figure merging as a kind of backpack with Stanisław August and the ermine on his coat. Finally, let us look into the eyes of Reitan himself. We will not meet his gaze, as he looks neither at us nor at the other figures in the painting. He directs his body, the torso with the clothes torn out, and his gaze upwards, beyond the space of the painting, at a slant. This too was necessary in the pose, although it seems to transcend a simple connection with the plot. At the same time, it opens up other connections. The first one is that with a tombstone. We know this kind of pose also from the royal tombs in the Wawel Cathedral in Kraków. One is especially noteworthy in this context, the tomb of King Stefan Batory in St. Mary's Chapel in the Wawel Cathedral. He reigned in the years 1576, 1587. This, in turn, reminds us of Mickiewicz again. In his 38th lecture of the first course of Slavic literature at the College de France in 1840, published in Polish in Felix Wrotnowski's translation, Mickiewicz refers to Batory when announcing the content of his course. He is the ideal Polish monarch. He elaborates of this idea later on, observing as follows. Stefan Batory is shown as the ideal patriot monarch. His policy was to withstand the barbarians, leave no peace or rest to the enemies of the church and the freedom, and to dedicate oneself wholeheartedly to the greatness and glory of one's country. Koniec cytatu. Moving on to literature, by comparing King Batory with Jan Kochanowski, his court poet for a decade, but first of all a poet recognized as the author of literary Polish, Mickiewicz concludes this part of the lecture by invoking the, I quote, greatest Polish man of letters and orator, Piotr Skarga. Matejko made all of them the protagonists of his paintings. However, Reitan Post brings to mind another work, the mention of which in connection with Reitan may seem risky to you. I am talking here about one of the sources of popularity of this post afterwards, as it was appropriated and restored from antiquity, one that Michelangelo used in the tombstones of the Medici family members, but in a most poignant way, projecting onto a surface in the work we know so well since our childhood. The creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel. We can now ask, what does Reitan's tearing of his clothes signify apart from his being a ritual gesture of biblical provenance, a telltale sign that something horrible, especially a sacrilege, has taken place? Tearing up his clothes, Reitan shows not only his body, but the gorget on the bare chest, turning not towards what is taking place in the painting, but upwards. As the gestures of Adam, the memorable component of the emblem of creation, is retracted here and directed inwards. It seeks and finds. It shows something that links the two images first of all. It is a body, which in Michelangelo painting of the created man is completely nude. It invokes something primary, sealed by the gorget revealed by Reitan on his naked chest. This is what he does, and this dialogue between paintings lets us send a trial of meanings which we can attribute to his conduct. Yet this is not the entire significance of Reitan's pose. Subject to the plane, stretched sideways in demonstrated a shiny torso at the intersection of streaks of blackness, one related to space, the other to plane. 2 lines. It was, I hope you can see it. In the former, the bent knee, which forms a blockade, a side of the rope and the hilt of the sabre, moved towards us, nearly to the edge of the painting. The latter element of blackness, the leg outstretched along the lower edge, and the section of the rope cast on the curtain, map out the access road to what Reitan merges with, in spite of the reality of the objects and space around him. He is reclining against the curtain, a prominent edge of the field, an element which offers him not so much physical, but visual support. Merging with it, he not so much guards the exit from the room, but the curtain itself. He safeguards access to himself and to the reality which he embodies with his conduct. He defends the curtain, the evident borderline, the connection with what cannot be adulterated by what is going on in the room, what is behind it, and what is immutable behind the painting, and thus not yet completed, still possible and marked by what he reveals on his chest. The curtain, which in 2 other places is clasped by the participants of the events, changes its status at the edge of the painting and becomes a solid support. At the same time, its way of being transcends the here and now of the event and its narrative, rejecting and invalidating the physical state determined by the reality of the depiction. It may become a buttress thanks to its timeless existence as a revealed part of the surface, along with the entry into play of its border. Therefore, the curtain cannot be clasped and moved here, but, in defiance of matter, serves as a support. The curtain provokes us, moreover, to look at this section on the other side of the door. The figure of Branicki screens and captures half of it. Without delving into this aspect, let us regard Poniński's gesture, forceful and dominant over the group. This is both a directing and commanding gesture, as well as an entry into the field of the curtain, reaching out for it. If, then, it reminds us of the gesture of creative contact, the disconnection of the contact, that is Reitan's withdrawing his hand, demonstrates that the gesture has been desecrated. The implication of its repetition defines it as anti-gesture, a token of usurpation, of the corruption of authority, which calls for invoking the ultimate powers, the only legitimate one, of the lawgiver in the face of lawlessness. Begging for and expecting the restoration of the covenant. So much for the painting. In conclusion, accompanied by other historical works by Matejko, I try to show you his another painting. So, step by step. I will try to reflect in your presence on the extent to which the painter ever, this kind of ever, and the field of signification set in motion by the term Matejko embody the leading issues related to our meeting. The descriptions of these issues refer to various possible roles played by paintings. They may be witnesses to history, tangible tokens of memory, as well as objects making history and the content of memory. They may appeal to imagination and help visualize stories from the past and memories. Matejko's art has been moreover credited with a possible motivational role, especially in a particular socio-political context. Finally, his renditions of the key moments of Poland history laid the groundwork for the culture of historical iconography, which was reiterated in history textbooks and other media of collective imagination. Indeed, it is hard to find something comparable in this respect. We can safely say that the word has become flesh. The amazed and complete knowledge about the historical incident is embodied literally. It is embodied by the figures whose selection, presence, and conduct demonstrate the forces which inform the entire incident. Matejko acts through his figures, hence the proverbial crowds in his paintings, as nearly each figure has a role to play. A hierarchy here, although prompted by our knowledge about the event, is far from easy. Or rather, like his protagonist, the author is afraid that they will remain unnoticed. Today, this hierarchy often eludes us, or else we cannot name the figures, but we are inclined to blame our own ignorance or read the role played by the protagonist in the action portrayed in the painting. We can, however, in line with an established custom, focus on the reconstruction of the intention of the author, aided by his own confession, quoted by me at the beginning of my speech. A historical reconstruction of the intention of the author is an important, but, as we know, not the only and exclusive legitimate way of assigning meaning to a work of art. The same applies to the text helping us reconstruct this intention, one way or another limited in their selection by their relation to a given work. Yet, the history of a painting is a history of an incessant revelation of meaning, of a never-ending investment in one's own experience of a viewer. If some implications of the meaning of the painting, which has been my protagonist here, seem risky to you, may they direct our attention away from the criticism of the author to the way of being of the work of the painting, and through this, towards matters related to the subject of our meeting. The medium. The limited surface with which the artist must struggle and which he seems to be in control of. Still, the longer he paints, the better he recognizes, appreciates, and considers the scope and manifestation of its power. The surface seems to be disappearing under the painting and is yet present in the conditions it imposes. It makes the painting ever open or exhibiting to abuse use a term of the great thinker Gemeinigkeit po niemiecku, or in English, mine own owners, mineness. This applies to the highest degree of those rare moments when I experience a shock in the face of a painting. This is then the only extra-verbal sense of the work. If we try to express it in words, we must take up a new interpretative path we did not know before. Aren't those paintings that seem the most open, the most fragile, too? Thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting paper. Szanowni Państwo,
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we have some time for questions and comments. So, Professor, if you'll allow me, from a Hungarian standpoint, that was a very interesting presentation on the painting of Matejko, because we have similar paintings. I'm not an art historian, but I'd like to open the discussion and maybe ask our participants, our guests, to ask questions or maybe to comment on this presentation. I'll follow your lead, Professor, and I'll answer the questions in Polish.
Drugie pytanie. So,
Professor, if you'll allow me, since last year I had the opportunity to see the painting in Budapest. There was an international exhibition of art from Central Europe, and the question that perhaps some of us have are colleagues who've come here from other countries, from abroad. Are the codes of Polish history, doesn't it make it difficult to understand the work of Matejko? Doesn't it hinder reception? Because you need to know your Polish history to appreciate these paintings. Like I said, I'll reply in Polish because I could probably reply in English, but it wouldn't correspond. I don't think it wouldn't be up to the standard of the question. And, well, I think, and I tried to make it clear, that reading the content of Matejko's paintings, his whole historical cycle, all these works were shown in Paris, so it was difficult. There were problems with understanding, and here there were no problems, and there was no controversy related to the way Matejko depicted these scenes, although the Battle of Grunwald against the Teutonic Knights, they said you couldn't discern anything because it was all such a confused mass and you couldn't identify the protagonists. But Rayton was an exception. Apart from appreciating the pictorial qualities of the painting, it did raise, there were objections occasioned by the fact that Matejko so wanted to show an infamous episode in Polish history, Actually, it wasn't an episode because there was a lot at stake, and if you remember what Rayton was objecting against, it was serious, but he said, I'll start with the wounds. And the sermon of Father Skarga, he showed Father Skarga as chastising, admonishing all the prominent representatives of the authorities, even though that painting is more complex. And than that, then we have Rayton and this Grotgarian Polonia bound or shackled, and that's where he began. So first of all, because this mission was accomplished, that's one, and that's what the response would have been. That's what the response was. He led to the Union of Lublin and Batory at Pskov, paintings that brought out the positive aspects of the union of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, or military victories. So I think this was legible, it was clear, and he also had the support. There were comments, comments on the painting that came practically instantly. He commented on the painting. I quoted Mickiewicz, but in painting, I think that Matejko is a class apart in terms of the scope and his influence. I mean, Artur Grotger, possibly, they were coevals. They began their careers in the early 1860s. The Warsaw incidents in 1861 were the theme of Grotger's first series of etchings and paintings, and Matejko showed Polonia bound. Matejko was thrilled with Grotger's work. Grotger did not live long. His series War adopted a more universal perspective on the matter, but it was a breakthrough in terms of the way the visual arts, the social function of painting, because Grotger was reproduced. His drawings, actually, he drew in charcoal in the hope that it would be reproduced, and you have these Grotger reproductions in many a Polish home. And then you have Matejko with his scope, his reach, his breadth, and the hitherto unknown quality, excellence of painting. So, and generally he took over the historical imagination. He didn't live long. His entire career spanned 30 years, but in that time he painted everything possible and also painted portraits of all the Polish kings. I wouldn't get involved in this. Actually, previously, we all knew what the historical, what the heroes of Polish history looked like. It was enough to look at a Matejko painting, and you knew what every king looked like, because he painted portraits of all the Polish kings, entirely imaginary, of course. And so in this regard, it's a phenomenon. I mean, despite his great popularity, the popularity of other practitioners of monumental history painting, Matejko was exceptional. I mean, no artist could compare in terms of influence. If we have any questions, then please feel free to. In that case, thank you very much, and we can end this session. Thank you very much, Professor.